Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to do a different kind of demo using some geometric shapes to show you how I deal with light and shade in my paintings. If you enjoy this here on YouTube, then please do hit that subscribe button. I have tons of other videos here on YouTube all about soft pastel. And then, if you'd like to learn even more, you can join me on Patreon, where I have my full library of real-time tutorials and lots more. Recently, I've been experimenting a little with still life and working from life. And I find it so tricky. It's been making me work really hard on both my drawing skills and my painting skills. But whether you're working from life or from a photograph, most of the time what we're trying to do as artists is describe the light. Whatever the object we're painting, our tonal value and our hue choices will be determined by the lighting that's hitting the object. In my most recent still life, I included some sugar cubes, but I actually made these sugar cubes at home, so they weren't very good cubes, and I found myself wishing while I was painting them that they were more precise cubes, as it would have made it a lot easier. Well, it was my intention to get hold of some better sugar cubes and do a little study of just them to see if I could improve. But I bought a box of sugar cubes and they're really no better than the ones that I made. So I had another thought. Wouldn't it be interesting to study the lighting on a range of 3D shapes? So that's what I'm going to do today. To keep things simple, I have made all of the objects white, and we have a sphere, an egg, a pyramid and a cube. And really, when I go to draw anything out, it's usually those basic geometric shapes that I'm starting with. And then throughout my painting process, I can still see those geometric shapes that I'm working with. So this is an exercise in simplifying. I'm going to shine a light from one side of these objects and also allow some daylight from my studio window to come from the other side. So I'm going to create an interesting lighting setup, and then I'm going to do a quick little painting of each object. So although I worked from life as the objects were sitting right beside me on the desk, I decided to include a little photo reference in the top corner for each one, and also the small selection of pastels that I used. So the first shape that I'm looking at is a sphere. And remember that I've got my warm lamplight coming from the right. And then you can see a cool reflection coming from the left where the light is coming in through the window. So I thought it would be interesting to have both a warm light source and a cool light source in these little studies. But the main thing that I'm thinking of at the start is the tonal value. So how dark or light does it need to be? And even though I'm painting nothing but white objects on a white background, you'll see that there's actually a lot of colour within that, because white won't show up unless you put those darker, contrasting colours down as well. So I'm noticing the darkest shadow, which is just right underneath the sphere. Then we've got the cool coloured shadow heading off to the left, and then a smaller warm coloured shadow coming out towards the right. So the warm lamplight actually makes this large cool coloured shadow happen. And then it's really the cooler light that's coming in through the window, casting that little warm shadow down to the right. So as well as tonal value, how light or dark it is, I'm really considering whether it's warm or cool colours that I'm looking for. I'm looking for any reflected colours. And in the case of a sphere or something that has no hard edges or corners on it, all of those gradations of colour need to be really smooth, so you can see that I'm blending a lot. There are no hard lines between the colours.
on the actual sphere itself. So everything gets blended and the gradation between one colour to the next is really soft and gradual. So you'll see on some of the later objects where there are sharp edges that the light and shade is much more obvious sometimes. But in the case where it's rounded edges, you've really got to think of gradual, subtle changes in colour. So it's a similar idea actually with the egg shape. Again, we've got no hard edges, but there is that same cool shadow coming out to the left and the smaller warm shadow coming out to the right. And you can see in the colour selection to the left, I've got my warm tones, those top three. I've got a white, then a very pale yellow tint, then a slightly deeper yellow sort of brown earth colour. And you can see that going on there just to create the warm side of the egg and the warm shadow that's being cast. Then the rest of those colours are all of my cooler shadow choices, from the very pale light blue that adds that final cool coloured reflection that's coming from the window, and then a range of other blue-violet tones. So even in this small study, I'm able to bring in some idea of complementary or opposite colours, because we have the cool blue violets against the warmer yellowy brown earth tones. So again, the brightest light coming from the right side of the objects. And on both of the more rounded objects, both the sphere and the egg, we get this bit of shadow almost in the centre of it. So actually facing us is where the light is touching the least. So we've got the light coming from the right, from behind slightly on the left. So we get this darker shadow in the middle area facing us. Now, if I were to change the lighting ever so slightly on these objects, we would get a whole different range of shadows being cast. And it was useful to add in a little bit of background colour around the objects. As you can see how I'm also able to use the background colour to enhance the edge of the egg or to create more tonal contrast between two colours. So colour is relative. Whatever colour you put down next to a certain colour is going to really affect its appearance. And especially when you're painting white things. So this is an especially interesting experiment because every object is white, yet we're able to put a ton of colour in there even though it's just white objects. So this is the first more angular shape where we've got edges and corners. And unlike the sphere and the egg, the light and shade, I think, is a lot more obvious on this type of shape. So where you have a hard edge and you can literally see where the light ends and the shadow begins. To me, that's always a little bit easier to replicate in a painting because you've got that hard edge between the two, unlike on the sphere and the egg where everything's more subtle and blended and the colour changes are more gradual. But again, just like with the other two objects, we've got the cool shadow coming out to the left and a smaller warm shadow on the right. And I really enjoyed doing this little experiment because light and shade becomes really obvious when you apply it on very definite angular shapes like this. And it's quite an interesting exercise in tonal value. Because although we know that it's white all over, the little pyramid becomes a completely different colour on one side than on the other. And sometimes when I'm painting, I actually like to exaggerate the tonal value contrast a little bit. So for example, here I'm actually starting off with much darker colours than I actually need on the cube. So you can always exaggerate those colours if you want. The aim isn't always to paint photorealistically. If you can understand the rules surrounding this, then you can bend those rules and you can push your colour choices further. You can enhance the tonal value sometimes to create more drama in your painting. But it's getting this basic understanding first of how light and shade works. And really helps your brain to accept the fact that sometimes you have to use really broad range of tonal values to create a white object, for example. So I really encourage you to be braver with your tonal values. If you're working in soft pastel, it's something that I'm always talking about in my tutorials. Coming in with a darker colour than you need first and working your way gradually up the tonal values, but laying down those base layers that are darker and more rich in contrast and allowing that to shine through your later layers. So that's kind of what I'm doing with these little shapes as well, starting a little bit darker than I intend it to be and adding lighter layers as I progress. So I'm constantly using each area to measure my other colours off. Obviously I need to lighten this left side of the cube a little bit. But you can see having that difference in tonal value on each face of the cube that we can see already starts to give a slightly 3D effect. So if you're finding that your paintings are looking a little bit flat and you're not quite creating that 3D appearance, then perhaps you need to look at your tonal values. And you can do that by changing your photo reference into grayscale. Take a quick progress shot of your painting and change that into grayscale too. Now when you compare the two, you've got them in grayscale without any of the colour information complicating things.
So you can see just how important tonal value is in creating something believably 3D. But don't forget about those other colour choices in terms of the temperature of the colour or the hue of the colour, as it's those subtle changes in colour that will give you a really convincing 3D effect. Let's look at a few examples where I can make use of this in my huge range of subject matters that I like to paint.
So a pretty obvious example here is in painting eyeballs. And when it comes to creating that spherical shape, I'm often imagining that it is a little sphere that's tucked in there. So you're going to get different shadows around the edges. But all the time, like when I'm adding the reflections here, I'm thinking of the curved form of the sphere. And it's not just with eyeballs. There are many places that you can find a spherical shape, like the bulbous end of the nose sometimes. And here I'm adding a cool reflection on the shadow side of the nose, just like I did on the little sphere demo. And of course this also applies to human eyes as well. And again, I'm thinking of the curved surface of the spherical shape. So another shape to think about sometimes is a cylinder. Quite often you'll find a cylindrical shape within man-made objects. And in this piece it actually incorporated some shapes that have rounded edges, shapes that have squared edges. So it was a mixture of a lot of different types of geometrical shape. But then also I can apply the cylinder idea when I'm painting animals' legs, for example. It really helps me to think about the 3D form, and I'm really analysing it in that way as if it were a more geometrical shape.
I hope this has been helpful. If you're interested in painting along with me in real time and learning lots more about soft pastel, then you can access a huge library of real-time tutorials at emmacolbertart.com, and that's including my most recent still life project. You'll find this on there too. This library is my full selection of tutorials available on Patreon, but you can browse them all here before signing up and see if there's a project that you fancy doing. But a huge thank you to everyone who has subscribed to me here on YouTube. You're really helping my channel grow. So thanks very much for watching this here, and until next time, happy pasteling.